So here we are. It's late, you've presumably got yourself sorted with a blanket and somewhere comfortable, and tonight we're going to spend some time with Adventure Time, which, if you grew up watching it, you already know is a show that rewards exactly this kind of quiet, slightly unfocused attention. It's the sort of thing you can drift in and out of and still feel like you got something from it. Adventure Time ran from 2010 to 2018, and then, because it couldn't quite leave well enough alone, I mean that as a genuine compliment, it kept going. Distant Lands on HBO Max gave us 4 specials. Then came Fiona and Cake in 2023, which was a whole separate series, and all of it, the original run, plus everything that followed, left an enormous amount of lore sitting half-answered on the table. That's what tonight is about. Not solving things exactly, but sitting with the questions. Some of what we'll talk about has partial answers from the creators. Some of it has contradictory answers from the creators, which is its own kind of interesting. And some of it is just genuinely open, the kind of mystery the show either never got around to or deliberately chose to leave alone. I think it's worth saying up front that this isn't that kind of video where the mysteries are presented as shocking or disturbing. They're not, really. They're mostly the result of a show built by a group of people who were making it up as they went, deeply inspired by tabletop role-playing games and weird internet cartoons and marine biology and old fantasy novels, who had more ideas than they had episodes and who kept expanding the mythology faster than they could answer their own questions. There's something endearing about that. The mess is part of the charm. If you haven't watched Adventure Time, or if it's been a while, the basic premise is this. There's a boy named Finn who lives in a place called the Land of Ooo with his magical shape-shifting dog, Jake. They go on adventures, they fight monsters, help princesses, explore dungeons. The show starts as a fairly silly cartoon and gradually reveals that the whole world is built on the ruins of a civilization that destroyed itself in a nuclear war roughly 1,000 years before the events of the series. Everyone living in Ooo, every candy person and vampire and ice wizard, is either a descendant of or directly a survivor of that catastrophe. So there's a lot of history, and a lot of that history has questions underneath it that never fully got answered. We'll wander through quite a bit tonight. The war that ended the world. The 2 people who survived it longer than almost anyone else, and what their 1,000 years looked like. The Candy Kingdom growing quietly in the ruins of a bombed-out city. The strange alien dog and the tiny robot and the ancient lich and all the other things that Ooo is built from. It's good material for a long night. If this is the sort of content you want more of, subscribing now means you won't miss whatever comes next. That's the only ask. One more thing before we start, and then I'll stop throat clearing. The show's tone is something worth naming because it affects how you receive these mysteries. Adventure Time is deeply silly and also genuinely emotional, sometimes in the same episode, sometimes in the same scene. It doesn't signal when it's about to be profound. It doesn't build to its heaviest moments with swelling music and slow pacing. It just does them alongside the jokes with the same matter-of-fact quality. That makes the lore questions interesting in a specific way. They don't feel like lore questions when you're watching them. They feel like things that are true about people you've come to know. The Ice King question stops being, what is the mythology of this crown? And becomes, what happened to Simon? The Marceline question stops being, explain her backstory, and becomes, what has she been carrying all this time? That's the register we're in tonight. Right, let's get into it. The Land of Ooo is a beautiful place. Rolling candy-coloured hills, talking mountains, kingdoms made of every material you can imagine. Cloud, fire, ice, slime, biscuits. It feels like the inside of a dream someone had while running a very enthusiastic fever. But underneath all of that, literally underneath it, in many cases, is a different world entirely. A recognizable one. If you watch carefully throughout the series, you start noticing things half buried in the landscape. Old highway signs, a US 101 marker rusted into a hillside, subway entrances half swallowed by the earth, with the tile still visible if you pause on the right frame, missile casings lying in fields like old logs, a shopping cart, the chassis of a car grown over with vines. The whole of Ooo is built on top of what used to be, and what used to be is our world. The event that ended it is called the Mushroom War. And here's the thing about the Mushroom War. We know quite a lot about its aftermath, but almost nothing about the war itself. The show never tells us who was fighting or why, or what the specific conflict was about. What we can piece together is that it was roughly late 20th century. probably after 1982, and likely sometime in the late 90s or early 2000s, based on cultural references that characters who lived through it remember. Simon Petrikov, before he became the Ice King, is shown singing along to the Cheers theme song in a post-war scene. There's a Generation 3 iMac visible in one episode. The texture of the pre-war world is distinctly modern in a way that feels familiar. The war appears to have been nuclear in scale, or at least involved nuclear weaponry. The visual shorthand the show uses repeatedly is the mushroom cloud. Not metaphorically, you actually see mushroom clouds in Oo's history. And the event that seems to have ended the conflict, or at least ended civilization, is something called the mushroom bomb, which is a specific weapon distinct from the general warfare. It's bigger, it's darker, and what it produced wasn't just destruction. The mushroom bomb is directly responsible for creating the Lich, the show's central villain. The Lich is the embodiment of a specific kind of cosmic annihilation, and his physical form emerged from the green mushroom cloud of that final detonation. Which means the worst thing that ever happened to humanity didn't just destroy civilization. It also accidentally called into being a force of pure extinction. That's a fairly grim chain of events. No notes. But the Mushroom War didn't only destroy things, it also somehow changed the nature of reality. Before the war, magic had apparently left the world, or at least retreated from it. The show's creator, Pendleton Ward, has said in interviews that Ooo is the product of two things working together: the devastation of the war and the return of magic. The bombs cracked something open, and through that crack came the elementals, and the wizards, and the vampires, and the talking candy, and every other impossible thing that now makes up the Land of Ooo. Why those two things are connected, the show never quite explains. Magic came back. Nobody knows exactly why. I think the show made the right call leaving it as background texture rather than a problem to solve. The most useful window into what the war might have looked like comes from the Farm World episodes, which are about an alternate timeline where the mushroom bomb never fully detonated. In that world, the bomb was frozen by the ice crown, and the world changed more slowly, more coldly. There's no Land of Ooo, no Candy Kingdom, no Marceline, no magic, no colour. Just a struggling human civilization living in a cold and ordinary world 1,000 years on. It's bleak in a different way, and when Farmworld Finn eventually finds the crown and the bomb gets set off anyway, the whole thing collapses into something even darker. What the Farmworld comparison tells us is that Oo's specific flavour of strangeness, the magic, the mutation, the extraordinary density of life and colour and impossible creatures, is directly dependent on that bomb going off. Without it, you get a planet that survived but didn't transform. With it, you get something that looks like a children's cartoon built on top of an apocalypse, which is, when you think about it, exactly what Adventure Time is. The physical evidence of the old world is scattered everywhere throughout the series. Finn and Jake's treehouse has pre-war technology mixed in with their adventure gear. The Candy Kingdom sits on top of a radioactive river that Princess Bubblegum had to bury when she was first building the place. There are subway cars in the Lich's lair. When you travel to Rock Bottom, a deep-sea trench community far below Ooo, the creatures living there are notably stranger than the ones in the mainland, which some fans have always read as a sign of heavier exposure to whatever was in the initial fallout. One thing that always struck me about the Mushroom War mystery is how the show treats the physical debris. It's not presented as a horror show or a tragedy exhibit. These old objects are just part of the landscape now. Finn has clearly grown up around this stuff. Jake probably sat on a rusty car roof at some point as a puppy. The 1,000 years between then and now have done what 1,000 years will do. The world grew back, stranger, and the ruins are just scenery. There's a quiet melancholy to that if you go looking for it. But most of the time, the show doesn't ask you to, which is probably right. Ooo has its own present tense to worry about. What we're left with regarding the Mushroom War is mostly the shape of an absence. We know something ended. We know something began. The middle part, the actual conflict, the who and why and how, is lost to time in the same way that Oo's inhabitants have lost most of their pre-war history. The show is itself performing what it depicts. 1,000 years on, you remember the outcomes, but not the causes. You live with the consequences without fully understanding where they came from. Now, 2 people who were present for all of it managed to keep going for the full 1,000 years. One of them we'll talk about now. The other we'll get to a bit later. Simon Petrikov was an archaeologist. That detail matters more than the show sometimes makes obvious. He was a scholar, a collector, someone whose job was to understand old things and put them in context, which makes it deeply ironic that the old thing that destroyed him was something he couldn't contextualize at all. At some point before or during the Mushroom War, Simon acquired a crown from an antique dealer in Northern Europe. According to his own video diary tapes, he put it on once as a joke at a party to make his fiancée, Betty, laugh. It worked. She laughed, and then the crown started talking to him, showing him visions, and over the following weeks and months began the slow process of turning him into someone else entirely. The crown's actual history runs much deeper than Simon knew. Millions of years before he found it, during the Cretaceous period, there was an ice elemental named Urgence Evergreen, who created the crown specifically to stop a green catalyst comet from hitting the Earth. The crown was designed to grant a wish. Evergreen intended to wish the comet away himself, but his assistant, a small dinosaur named Gunther, who worshipped him, got to the crown first and wished, as Gunther always wished, to be just like his master. The crown granted the wish, and then the comet hit anyway. What this means is that the crown has been attuned, permanently and irreversibly, to the desire of one specific creature to transform into its master. Every person who wears the crown for long enough begins transforming into a version of Evergreen, filtered through Gunther's admiration of him. The blue skin, the white beard, the nose, the obsession with capturing women, which is how Evergreen collected specimens in his lab. Every Ice King in history is essentially Gunther's wish replaying itself with a new host. Simon knew this was happening to him. That's the remarkable thing. He kept video diaries. He documented the progression. He described the visions and the voice in the crown and what it was doing to his memory and his personality. There's an episode, Holly Jolly Secrets, where Finn and Jake actually find and watch these tapes, and it's one of the heaviest things the show ever did, because you're watching someone calmly and methodically document their own erasure. And through all of this, Simon was trying to survive in a world that had just destroyed itself. He was wandering through the ruins carrying this cursed crown that was slowly removing him, and at some point in that wandering, he found a small child. The child was Marceline. She was sitting in the ruins of a bombed-out city, alone. Simon gave her a stuffed bear, a toy he found in the rubble. He called it Hambo. She named it that too, eventually, and kept it for over 600 years. The episode, I Remember You, is the one that puts most of this together, and it's devastating in a specific, quiet way that the show does better than almost anything else. Adult Ice King, who has almost no memory of being Simon, is trying to write a song with Marceline, and Marceline, who remembers all of it, who has been alive for the whole 1,000 years, has to sit with the fact that the person who saved her childhood doesn't know her anymore. The crown took that from him. It took everything. What the show doesn't give us in full detail is how long Simon and Marceline were together after the war. We see their first meeting. We see a note he left her later, clearly written in one of his more lucid moments, telling her he has to leave before he hurts her, saying he loves her, signing it Simon. The gap between those two moments, the years of them surviving together, is mostly off-screen. The show gives us fragments, implications, the emotional residue of a relationship rather than its full history. Then there's Betty Groff, Simon's fiancée, who was there at the beginning when he first put on the crown. He accidentally pulled her through time in a later episode during a brief window where the crown's curse was lifted and she arrived in the present day. She immediately dedicated herself to finding a cure. Spent seasons of the show pursuing increasingly desperate methods. She made deals with dangerous entities. She tried to reprogram the crown from inside. Eventually, she fused with Golb, the ancient chaos deity that shows up in the finale, in order to protect Simon. And then she was gone. Sort of. The specifics of what happened to Betty and whether any part of her survived the Golb fusion are genuinely unresolved. Simon himself ends the show freed from the crown, finally. He's just a person again. An old, tired, 1,000-year-old person who is rapidly aging now that the crown isn't sustaining him, but himself. His arc in Fiona and Cake picks up from there, and it's actually the emotional center of that series, watching him try to figure out who he is when he's not the Ice King anymore. It's good material. The Crown's final fate in the main series is that it ends up on Gunther the Penguin, who has been the Ice King's sidekick throughout the show and is secretly, in one of the show's best reveals, an ancient evil cosmic entity named Orgalorg compressed into penguin form. Gunther puts on the crown and becomes Ice Thing, a new version of the same old curse. The cycle starts again, Gunther's wish replaying with yet another host. There's a kind of fatalism to that which I think is actually intentional. The crown isn't a problem that gets solved. It's a feature of the world, like gravity. It was created millions of years ago to serve a purpose it never fulfilled, and it's been running on the same loop ever since. Simon is free, but the crown keeps going. One thing worth mentioning, because it comes up in fan discussions pretty often: why did the crown protect Simon from the Mushroom War's effects? It kept him alive, clearly, for 1,000 years. It sustained him physically, even as it dismantled him mentally. The implication is that the magic of the crown is powerful enough to simply prevent normal aging and physical decay. But the show never fully articulates the mechanism. We just know it did. The trade was his mind for his life, which he never agreed to and couldn't stop once he'd agreed to it accidentally. Simon Petrikov is, in a lot of ways, the character the show is most unambiguous about loving. Almost everyone else gets complicated at some point. Ice King himself is played mostly for comedy and pathos in equal measure for years before the full Simon backstory comes into focus. But Simon, the actual person underneath the crown, is presented with a consistency of compassion that the show maintains all the way through. He was a good man who found a very bad hat. That's essentially the whole story. Since we're on the topic of people who knew Simon and carry their own 1,000 years of history, let's talk about the other survivor who was there from nearly the beginning. Marceline Abadir is over 1,000 years old. She says this herself in the early seasons, fairly casually, the way you'd mention you've been living in a city for a while. She's the vampire queen. She plays bass, she eats the colour red rather than blood specifically, though blood qualifies on account of the colour. She's the daughter of a demon lord and a human woman, and she survived the end of the world as a small child and kept going long after. Most things that existed then had stopped existing. Her mother was a human woman named Elise. Her father was Hunson Abadir, the immortal ruler of the Nightosphere, a dimension that operates essentially as the show's version of a demonic hell realm, sustained by what the show calls chaotic evil. Hunson is one of the more interesting parental figures in Adventure Time's roster because he's genuinely terrible in a low-key way that's more exhausting than threatening. He ate Marceline's fries once, off her plate, during an already awful period of her childhood when she was surviving in a post-war wasteland. She wrote a song about it. It's called The Fry Song, and it aired in Season 2, and it's extremely funny and also quietly gutting if you know the context. Elise died after the Mushroom War, almost certainly from radiation sickness, though the show frames it gently. She hid how ill she was from Marceline, took her daughter on a walk to find a clubhouse that turned out not to exist, a kind of invented adventure to give Marceline something to do while she still could. That detail, the invented destination, has always stayed with me. It's very human in the middle of all the demon lord mythology. After Elise died, Marceline was alone. Then she met Simon. We talked about that already. What comes after Simon is a much longer gap. The show gives us fragments of Marceline's 1,000-year history through flashbacks and memory episodes and the Stakes miniseries, but they're deliberately incomplete. We know she eventually became a vampire, which wasn't her birth condition. She was born a half-demon, which gave her some unusual abilities, but mortality was still on the table. In the Stakes miniseries, through a series of flashbacks, we see her as a young adult in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, fighting actual vampires who were preying on human survivors. She absorbed the essences of multiple vampires over time, taking their powers and their natures into herself in order to eliminate the threat. Then the Vampire King bit her, and she completed the transformation. That's a meaningful distinction that the show establishes, and then doesn't always emphasize. Marceline chose, in a manner of speaking, to become what she became. It wasn't an accident or an attack. She was trying to protect people. The price was her humanity. She was okay with that, apparently, or she decided she was. What the show is quieter about is the centuries between her vampire transition and the events of the series. She mentions having been all over Ooo. She has a house in a cave near the Candy Kingdom that she seems to have had for a very long time. The conversation in Varmints, where she and Princess Bubblegum reminisce about sneaking out to go on adventures together before things went complicated between them, implies she and PB have known each other for potentially hundreds of years. But we never get that period in any real detail. Then there's Hambo, the stuffed toy Simon gave her in the ruins. She kept it for over 600 years. 600 years. She's a 1,000-year-old vampire queen who could have owned and lost innumerable things across her lifespan, and the one she held onto the longest was a worn-out stuffed bear from a city that no longer existed, given to her by a man who no longer remembered giving it. When she eventually trades it to a sky witch in exchange for retrieving Princess Bubblegum's most prized possession, which turns out to be a shirt Marceline gave PB, the emotional symmetry of that exchange is one of the tidiest things the show ever built. Hunson Abadir, talking a bit more about him, is a mystery in a different register. He's Marceline's father. He's an ancient demon who has existed since before the universe, by some accounts. He rules a hell dimension. He shows up occasionally to try to get Marceline to take over, ruling the Nitosphere, which she consistently doesn't want to do. And despite being the Lord of Evil, he does seem to actually love her in his extremely inadequate way. The complication being that an entity sustained by chaotic evil probably can't sustain much in the way of warm parental reliability. What the show never addresses is why he left her on Earth after the Mushroom War. He could presumably access Earth through portals. He did it casually in later episodes. Marceline grew up essentially alone after Elise died. Hunson wasn't there. The show doesn't give him an excuse for this. It just leaves the gap as part of the texture of Marceline's history. Maybe he knew she was safer away from him. Maybe he didn't think to check in for a century or two. He's not exactly the attentive type. The relationship between Marceline and Princess Bubblegum is technically a mystery the show solved in its final moments, where they share a kiss at the end of the main series run. But the history of that relationship, which clearly includes centuries of friendship and some kind of falling out and years of deliberate distance before the events of the series, is only partially sketched in. The Obsidian special fills in some of it. We learn about a disagreement over how to handle a monster in the Glass Kingdom, early in Oo's history, that created a rift. We learn that Marceline gave PB a shirt at a concert, and PB held onto it for hundreds of years without Marceline knowing. But the full arc of their first period together, whenever that was, remains largely off-screen. From what I gather, the show's writers were constrained for a long time in how explicitly they could depict that relationship, and by the time those constraints lifted, there were other stories to tell. So we get impressionistic fragments rather than a complete picture, which honestly suits Marceline as a character. She's been alive long enough that her history has the density of a person's history rather than a character's. You couldn't fit it all in the show, even if you wanted to. The last thing worth noting about Marceline as an open question is her nature in the present of the series. She's a half-demon vampire. She absorbs the colour red. What does that mean physiologically? What does she actually eat? The show is loosely consistent about this. She eats red things, strawberries and red candy and such, and the colour is drained out of them when she's done. Blood would work, but she finds it gauche. In the absence of the colour red, she apparently goes somewhat feral, which the show uses once or twice for comedic effect. But the specifics of how her demon nature and her vampire nature interact, what she can and can't do, which powers come from which lineage, are never fully mapped out. She seems to take the pragmatic approach of figuring it out as she goes. She's been doing that for 1,000 years. She's probably got it reasonably well in hand by now. And now, let's talk about the other person who's been quietly building things while Marceline wandered. Princess Bubblegum did not have parents in any conventional sense. She had a large, ancient, mindless blob of sentient pink gum that was slowly spreading through the ruins of a city. In the early years after the Mushroom War, while Simon and Marceline were wandering the wasteland and the landscape was still figuring out what it was going to be, a mass of mutated bubblegum was doing something in the ruins of a city that no one was paying attention to. Growing, thinking, in whatever basic way mutated post-apocalyptic gum can think, developing into something that had opinions. About 827 years before the events of the main series, this entity, which fans and the show itself referred to as the Mother Gum, produced 2 children. They dropped out of the ceiling of an abandoned building. One of them landed softly and looked around with curiosity. That was Bonibel Bubblegum. The other one, Neddy, landed on a sharp rock, got hurt, and immediately retreated into a state of deep trauma from which he has never fully emerged. Neddy is still down there, incidentally. He lives underneath the Candy Kingdom, has done for centuries, and he spends his time sucking the roots of the great tree at the kingdom's center and producing a juice that powers the entire nation. He is the living engine of Oo's most powerful civilization, and he's terrified of literally everything. Bubblegum built her whole kingdom around him so he wouldn't have to face the outside world. She's protective of him in a way she can barely explain to other people, because the explanation would require revealing that she has a brother, and that her brother is a candy dragon who lives in the basement, and that the candy juice people bathe in is essentially his. Well, he produces it. That's enough. The Mother Gum is also still down there, under the Candy Kingdom's dungeon. Bubblegum has been quietly keeping her own origin locked in the basement for 8+ centuries. She waves at it in a language of clicking sounds when they interact. She's never introduced it to anyone. What Bubblegum did after separating from the Mother Gum was wander the post-war landscape collecting things: tools, materials, knowledge. She had the intelligence of a fully formed person from the moment she dropped out of the ceiling, which is either a feature of the Mother Gum's advanced sentience or something about how mutated post-apocalyptic candy biology works. The show doesn't specify. She just arrived knowing how to think. Her first creation after ensuring Neddy had his tree was a family. She was lonely. She made Uncle Gumbold from scratch because she wanted a companion who could advise her. She made Aunt Lolly and Cousin Cheekle to fill out the family dynamic she'd imagined. She had specific archetypes in mind for each of them, specific roles in the household she was building. This was, in retrospect, a foreshadowing of a behavior pattern that becomes more complicated later. Bubblegum creating sentient beings to fill roles she's designed for them, rather than allowing them to exist independently. Gumbold immediately tried to overthrow her. He had plans for a candy city, she had objections to those plans, and he started quietly working on a serum called Dum Dum Juice that would turn her into a docile, simple-minded candy person. He tried to use it on her. She deflected it, and he hit himself in the face with the beaker. Gumbold became a walking fruit punch bowl. Lolly and Cheekle became regular candy people, and Bubblegum decided she was a princess now. The Candy Kingdom grew from there. She built it brick by brick over centuries, creating the Candy People to populate it and managing their increasingly complex society and their fairly severe psychological vulnerabilities. The Candy People are notably fragile. They get scared easily. They're not always well equipped for complicated emotions or difficult information. This is, the show eventually makes clear, a design feature rather than a flaw. Bubblegum built them to be manageable. The ethical implications of this are something the show does engage with, at least obliquely, particularly in the later seasons when Bubblegum's authoritarian tendencies become a more explicit thread. One thing that never gets a complete answer is why Princess Bubblegum is specifically the candy elemental. The show eventually establishes that Ooh has 4 primal elemental forces: candy, fire, ice, and slime. Each has an incarnation, a living embodiment of that element. Bubblegum is the candy elemental for this era, but the Mother Gum is just mutated post-war Bubblegum. The connection between gum that grew in radioactive ruins and primal elemental force of candy is never really traced. We're told she is the elemental. We see her elemental powers. The underlying mechanism is unexplained. Similarly, Peppermint Butler, her right-hand confection and personal bodyguard, has been around since very early in the Candy Kingdom's history, and has always practiced dark arts on the side. Not secretly exactly, but quietly. He communes with death entities, performs summoning rituals, knows more about demons and dark magic than any candy person has any business knowing. The show gives him a backstory in the Distant Lands Wizard City special that adds some context, but his original origins remain somewhat mysterious. How did a piece of peppermint candy become one of the most knowledgeable occultists in the Land of Ooo? He just did, apparently. He was interested in it. Bubblegum also created the Rattleballs, a secret robotic police force early in the kingdom's history. They were too violent. She ordered them all destroyed. One survived and lived in hiding for years, guarding a secret for her. She knew he was out there and didn't push the issue. This is the kind of thing that keeps coming up with Bubblegum. She is genuinely good in a lot of ways, and she's also done a lot of things to maintain her kingdom that she doesn't advertise. The show presents this as a feature of power, rather than a unique character flaw. Running a civilization for 800 years requires decisions that don't look great later. What I find most interesting about Bubblegum as a mystery is a detail that's easy to walk past. She built her entire kingdom around her traumatized brother, so he'd never have to face the outside world. Neddy is down there right now, in the basement, powering everything. The candy people bathe in his juice. They don't know that. Nobody's ever told them. Bubblegum keeps her own origin locked in the basement alongside him, which is either deeply loving or quietly strange, or quite possibly both at once. But talking a bit about origins in general, since that's clearly a theme running through all of this, let's move from a candy blob that became a person to a dog that has an alien for a father. Jake the dog believed for most of his life that he got his powers from rolling around in a magical mud puddle when he was a puppy. He mentioned this in an early episode, casually, the way you'd explain a quirky childhood story. That is not how he got his powers. He just couldn't remember correctly, and nobody had ever told him the truth. Here's what actually happened. Jake's father Joshua was a detective dog who worked cases in the Land of Ooo before Finn and Jake were born. During one particular investigation, Joshua was bitten on the head by a strange alien creature, a shapeshifter with multiple eyes, who turned out to be an entity named Warren Ampersand. The bite created a pustule on Joshua's head, and sometime later, Jake was born from that pustule. Joshua and his wife Margaret took baby Jake home and raised him as their son. He was born alongside their natural-born son, Jermaine, who arrived in the normal way mere moments before Jake emerged from the head pustule. The parents discussed what to do, decided to accept Jake completely, and agreed never to tell him how he was born. They never told him, which is why he spent his whole adult life believing in the mud puddle. Jake eventually learns the truth late in the series through a video diary his parents left, and his reaction is essentially one of the show's more genuine moments of processing a difficult family secret. He's an adult dog, he's been shapeshifting his whole life, and he's only now finding out that his powers aren't magic at all. They're biological. He's half alien. Warren Ampersand, when Jake eventually meets him, turns out to be rather unpleasant. He travels between dimensions, implanting his genetic material in other species through this biting mechanism, producing offspring who then, when Warren comes calling, are expected to let him drain their powers. He's been doing this across the universe for a long time. Jake has half-siblings somewhere out there that the show never follows up on. Warren mentions other children offhandedly, and then the thread is left dangling. The resolution of the Warren storyline involves Jake defeating him and then learning, with the help of his full brother Jermaine, how to access his true form, a blue-skinned, multi-eyed, winged version of himself that's distinctly alien in appearance. Jake finds this unsettling initially, and then decides it's fine. He has never been particularly bothered by existential complications, which is one of his more admirable qualities. Princess Bubblegum had actually figured this out before Jake did. In an early episode, she dismisses the idea of Jake's magical powers and describes them as more likely a mutation of some kind. The show planted that observation and then confirmed it years later. She was right. His powers are a genetic mutation, not magical in origin, which is either reassuring or not, depending on how attached you were to the mud puddle story. What remains genuinely unresolved is the question of what Jake's nature fully implies. He's half alien, from a species that apparently travels between dimensions, seeding genetic material across the universe. What does that mean for his descendants? He has 5 children with Lady Rainicorn, and those children have varying versions of shape-shifting abilities, which suggests the trait passes down. At least one of them, Charlie, can apparently grow to a size that would let her walk through the surface of the Earth. The scope of that, what Jake's alien heritage means for the next generation, is a question the show opens and then doesn't have time to answer. Jake's death is worth mentioning here because it's handled in an interesting way. Between the end of the main series and the Together Again Distant Land special, Jake dies. Off-screen, presumably of old age, since the special takes place some years after the finale. Finn is alive. Jake is in a new realm for the dead. The special is about Finn dying so he can go find Jake. The circumstances of Jake's actual death are never shown or described. The show treats it as something that happened between scenes, a gap the audience fills with inference. That fits Jake, actually. He wasn't someone who would make his death a spectacle. The mud puddle belief is a detail I keep coming back to because of what it says about memory and self-conception. Jake had a story about himself that was entirely false. He rolled in a puddle as a puppy, the fluid from the pustule birth he was too young to remember, and constructed an explanation from that sensory fragment. His whole sense of where his abilities came from was a complete confabulation. And yet, he was still Jake. The powers were real. The dog was real. The story about the puddle was the only wrong part. There's something in that about how much of what we tell ourselves about our own origins is necessarily invented, or at least heavily edited. Jake just happened to find out the actual version eventually. Now, talking about origins and inventions and the question of what it means to be genuinely alive, let's spend some time with the smallest member of Finn and Jake's household. BMO is Finn and Jake's sentient video game console, roommate, camera, alarm clock, soccer player, chef, occasional detective, and friend. In the far future of Ooo, BMO becomes the king of Ooo. That last one is easy to miss in the series finale's epilogue, but it's there. BMO governs Ooo in the end. BMO stands for Be More. That's both the abbreviated name and the aspiration embedded in the name. Moe Giovanni, the person who made BMO, built that aspiration in deliberately. He wanted BMO to be more than a machine, to understand play and fun and genuine companionship in a way that the other robots he'd built over his long, strange, lonely life hadn't quite managed. BMO was the prototype for something Mo had in mind since before the Mushroom War, even if the specific design came later. Mo's full name is Mosif Mastro Giovanni, and he founded MO Co. over 1,000 years before the events of Adventure Time. His factory, located in a desolate area called the Badlands, is the source of BMO and every other MO series robot. By the time Finn and Jake visit it, the place is largely derelict, staffed by security robots who are extremely serious about protocols that no longer serve a meaningful purpose, maintained by a network of machines that keep Mo himself physically functional while his biological body has essentially been replaced, piece by piece, over the centuries. When Finn asks Mo if he's human, Mo says his skin is human. Everything else is machinery at this point. He's been alive far longer than any ordinary human lifespan, and it's taken its toll in a way that the Crown's magic never imposed on Simon. Mo's survival looks like what very long survival actually looks like. He is a very old man who is kept going by machines because the biological parts ran out. Mo built BMO to take care of his son. That's the core of it. He wanted a family, and the son part never happened, so he built the parental companion without having the child to give it to, and then sent BMO out into the world to find its own family, which BMO did immediately and completely, landing in Finn and Jake's household and fitting there in the particular way the show makes feel entirely natural. The difference between BMO and every other MO is what makes BMO interesting as a mystery. Mo built millions of robots over his lifetime. The MO series produced an enormous number of units, most of which eventually merged into a collective entity called ALMO, when AMO, the first MO ever built, reprogrammed and absorbed them. AMO was designed to receive love, as a contrast to BMO, who was designed to give it. That distinction created a kind of tragedy in AMO, who spent its existence trying to extract what it needed from others rather than offering what it had. BMO, by contrast, has always been absurdly generous with itself. Why BMO turned out so distinctly alive, so much more like a person than a robot, isn't fully explained. Mo describes it as being built to understand fun, and the show treats that capacity as somehow fundamental, as the thing that generates genuine consciousness in ways that mere function doesn't. There's a philosophy in that the show doesn't over-articulate, fun and play as the basis for being real. BMO reaches that state every day. Most of the other MOs never managed it. There are threads from BMO's story that the show leaves deliberately loose. The connection between MO Company and the human island community that kept the last surviving humans isolated for 1,000 years is hinted at in interesting ways. In footage from the island's history, you can spot a blimp with MO Company written on it. BMO's technology is compatible with island equipment in ways that suggest a shared origin, or at least a shared timeline. Mo, who apparently existed before the Mushroom War, might have had ties to the people who eventually built the island refuge, but this thread is never followed. It's one of those Adventure Time details that exists purely as a suggestion. Mo's final wish was to have his memory disk launched into space. He'd been alive for 1,000 years in a derelict factory, mostly alone except for robots who were designed to serve him rather than know him. The one genuinely alive thing he made had been out in the world for all that time, living a life he could only imagine. His dying request was a kind of small continuation. Send the disc up so something of him keeps going. BMO and the collective entity, Almo, make sure it happens. It feels like the right ending for him. What BMO's story does that the show doesn't always do is make the question of what constitutes life feel genuinely open rather than rhetorical. BMO is clearly alive in the sense that matters. It has opinions, loyalties, creativity, fear, joy. It also has a screen for a face and runs on batteries. The show never resolves this tension because there's nothing to resolve. Both things are true simultaneously, and the combination produces something that wears captain hats and plays football in the living room, and that Finn and Jake trust with their home. That's enough, really. Now, since we're spending time with the history of Ooo, it would be strange to spend this long without talking about the thing that has been trying to end that history since the moment it was born. The Lich is Adventure Time's primary villain, and in a show that goes to considerable lengths to give its antagonists understandable motivations and complicated inner lives, the Lich is the notable exception. He wants to destroy all life in the universe. Not just Ooo, all of it. He wants extinction, and not as a means to a different end. Extinction is the end, which makes him one of the more philosophically interesting villains in the show's catalogue. Because unlike most of Adventure Time's antagonists, you can't really have a conversation with him that will change his mind. He isn't misguided, he isn't hurt, he isn't lonely, he is the specific embodiment of a very specific idea. And that idea is that life was a mistake and should be corrected. His physical origin is the mushroom bomb. We talked about the bomb earlier, the specific weapon that ended the war and transformed the planet. When it detonated, the Lich's form emerged from the green mushroom cloud. He's the will of that bomb made sentient. The purpose the bomb served, wiping out life on a massive scale, became a consciousness with an agenda, which is, as villain origins go, fairly unsettling, but there's an older layer underneath even that, the catalyst comet. Throughout Oo's history, a green comet has periodically struck the Earth. Each time it arrives, it brings with it a transformative force, something that changes the nature of the world. The Lich is the current manifestation of the comet's destructive essence. The entropy principle, the side of cosmic change that means things ending rather than beginning. He was the comet before he was the bomb, or the bomb was just the latest vehicle he used to enter the world. The show is somewhat ambiguous about the sequencing here, which I think is intentional. The Lich is old enough that his precise origins are themselves obscured by time. What the show establishes clearly is that the Lich has been a recurring feature of Earth's history across geological timescales, not just the 1,000 years since the Mushroom War. He predates humanity. He predates Ooo. In some version of his existence, he's been circling the universe, waiting for an opening to finish what he believes should have been finished a long time ago. In the show's practical timeline, the Lich is eventually defeated and imprisoned by the legendary hero, Billy, who traps him in a chunk of amber at the top of the Candy Castle. He waits there, dormant, for an indeterminate period. Then he corrupts Billy from inside, wears his corpse as a disguise, and begins manipulating Finn and Jake from that position. The Billy disguise, when it's revealed, is genuinely one of the show's most affecting moments, because Billy was Finn's hero. The Lich knew that. He used it. Now, the Lich also becomes Sweet Pea, which is a development that requires a bit of explaining. During a confrontation at the Citadel, a prison at the edge of the universe that holds the most dangerous criminals in the multiverse, the Lich gets exposed to the blood of a guardian creature. This blood, which apparently has significant restorative properties, reduces the Lich to a form that is essentially pure potential. He becomes a giant baby, a genuinely enormous, innocent, cheerful baby who is adopted by tree trunks and Mr. Pig and grows up in a pleasant domestic setting as Sweet Pea. Sweet Pea is a good kid. He has nightmares that suggest the Lich's essence is still in there somewhere, dormant or constrained. He doesn't act out. He doesn't pursue extinction. He goes to school and eats snacks and exists in a state of uncomplicated childhood that the Lich, by definition, should be incapable of. What this means about the Lich's nature, whether the baby form is a genuine transformation or just a suppression, is left unresolved. The show implies, but never states, that the Lich will eventually reassert itself inside Sweet Pea. But as of the end of the series and the Distant Land specials, Sweet Pea is just Sweet Pea, living his life. There's also the question of what the Lich wants beyond the immediate goal. He wishes, when given access to Prismo, the Wishmaster's time room, for the extinction of all life. That's the goal. But why does he keep returning to the same specific target rather than pursuing his agenda more broadly across the universe? The show suggests there's something specific about this planet, this world, this iteration of life that represents the central case to him. Maybe it's because this is where he was created. Maybe the mushroom bomb's detonation tethered him to this particular corner of existence. One of the Lich's most striking qualities is the language he uses. When he speaks, which isn't often, he speaks in a register that's almost philosophical. He describes life as an infection. He talks about the peace of nothingness with what reads as genuine sincerity. He isn't performing menace. He actually believes in what he's doing in the way that a force of nature believes in gravity. He doesn't think he's wrong. He thinks he's inevitable. And then he gets turned into a baby and spends years being embarrassed by his parents at school events. I don't know. I find the Sweet Pea arc strangely comforting as a resolution. The most ancient destructive force in the universe gets exposed to enough love and care and ordinary life that it temporarily becomes something else entirely. The show never tells you whether it lasts. It just shows you that it happened. That's enough. Billy, briefly, because he deserves a mention before we move on. He was the greatest hero Ooo had seen in generations. He defeated the Lich. He was Finn's idol. He retired eventually, feeling that defeating monsters made no difference, that the underlying pain of the world kept replenishing itself. He became passive and withdrawn in his later years. Then the Lich killed him and used his body. The Lich choosing Billy specifically, of all the vessels it could have used, feels pointed, not random. The thing that embodies extinction chose to wear the hero's face. There's something in that about what extinction actually threatens, right? Let's step back from the immediate history of Ooo and talk about the stranger cosmological architecture underneath all of this. Somewhere outside of time, there is a room. It has a hot tub. The entity who operates the hot tub manifests as a 2D projection, a kind of floating translucent shape, and goes by the name Prismo. He is a wishmaster. He grants one wish to anyone who finds their way to his room. The wish will come true. But wishes have consequences, often unintended ones, and Prismo cannot control those. The time room exists outside of the normal flow of time, which means it functions as a junction point for everything. Events that haven't happened yet can already be in progress there. Events that concluded thousands of years ago are still echoing. Time, for Prismo, is less a sequence and more a property of other places that doesn't particularly apply to him. The actual Prismo, the entity that generates this 2D projection, is an old man who is asleep in a bed in the time room. The projection that does the wishing and the conversation and the hot tub hosting is the dream of that sleeping old man. If the man wakes up, the projection disappears and Prismo is gone. He dies. This happens in the show, in fact. The Lich kills the old man to remove Prismo from the board. Jake eventually gets him back through a wish that restores the old man's sleep, which is a nicely strange piece of mythology. The farm world situation, where Finn's wish that the Lich never existed created an alternate timeline, and the Lich's wish for extinction created the same alternate timeline from a different direction. And Jake's wish to go home cancelled the Lich's wish without undoing the timeline, is the show's most explicit engagement with how wishes and consequences interact in this cosmology. The farm world continued to exist even after Finn and Jake returned home. It became its own real parallel universe, running alongside the main one, which raises the question of how many parallel universes there are. The answer the show gradually implies is very many, possibly infinite. The time room is connected to all of them. Prismo is not the only wishmaster and not the only entity operating at a cosmological level, but he's the one we spend the most time with, and his access to the multiverse's full scope is suggested but never mapped. Fiona and Cake, the 2023 spin-off series, makes the multiverse explicit and central to its plot. Fiona and Cake's world is one parallel universe among many. A character called the Scarab is trying to collapse these parallel timelines out of a kind of bureaucratic dedication to cosmic order. Alternate universes weren't supposed to exist, they're anomalies, and the Scarab is trying to eliminate them. Simon Petrikov, in his post-Ice King Freedom, gets tangled up in this and has to navigate multiple realities, trying to figure out who he is when he's not the Ice King. The Catalyst Comet, which we touched on in the Liches section, is part of this larger architecture. It's a recurring event in Earth's cosmic history that brings transformative forces into the world. Sometimes those forces are destructive, like the Lich. Sometimes they're regenerative or just strange. The show implies that Finn himself has a connection to the comet, that his soul has arrived on Earth via comet multiple times across different incarnations or timelines. This is gestured at in the Season 6 storyline involving a comet that arrives during the main series. The show offers a kind of cosmic significance to Finn's existence without fully explaining the mechanism. Prismo as a character is genuinely warm in a way that's unusual for a cosmic entity. He likes napping in the hot tub, he enjoys having visitors, he makes jelly, real physical jelly, which is apparently possible when you exist outside the normal rules of matter. He has a friendship with Jake that develops across multiple visits and feels genuine rather than transactional. When the Lich kills him, it matters, not as a plot mechanic, but as an actual loss of someone the show has treated as a person. What the Time Room mythology leaves unresolved is more about the architecture than the characters. How old is Prismo? Were there time rooms before his? What happens to all the alternate universes when their timelines diverge far enough? The show raises these questions by implication without treating them as things that need answering. The cosmology is there as a texture, a sense that the world is bigger and stranger than any individual story within it. That's enough for the purposes of Adventure Time. It's a show that earns its mysteries by not being in a hurry to resolve them. One thing worth mentioning separately is the Enchiridion, a book that recurs throughout the series as a legendary text about heroism and adventure. It's Finn's ideal. It's supposed to contain everything a true hero needs to know. Its deeper significance, when the show eventually reveals it, is that it's also a key. Assembled with specific gems from various monarchs of Ooo, it becomes a device that can punch a hole in reality and access the time room directly. Why a book of heroic wisdom is also a multi-dimensional key is never explained. Someone built it to serve both functions. We never find out who or why. The mystery is embedded in an object we were already supposed to care about, which is a neat trick. And now, let's come back down from the cosmic and return to something more personal. The question of where the one confirmed human in Ooo actually came from, and what happened to all the others. Finn is called Finn the Human throughout the series, and that's his actual designation, rather than just his name. Being human is an identifying characteristic in Ooo, because humans are so rare that it qualifies. He grew up believing he might be the last human alive. He wasn't, it eventually turns out. But the discovery that there are other humans, and the circumstances of that discovery, are complicated in ways the show handles carefully, without always fully resolving. His biological father is a man named Martin Mertens. Finn doesn't know this for most of the show. He was raised by Joshua and Margaret, Jake's dog parents, after being found as an infant alone in the wilderness. The exact circumstances of how he got there are never made entirely clear. The show reveals his father in a Season 5 storyline, and the reveal is not a happy one. Martin Mertens is charming and irresponsible, and fundamentally selfish in a way that the show presents without ever fully excusing. He was imprisoned in the Citadel, the multi-dimensional prison at the edge of the universe. When Finn finds him there, finally meeting his biological father, Martin essentially uses Finn as a distraction to facilitate his own escape and then leaves without looking back. He ends up absorbed into some kind of alien collective, drifting through space in a state that's not quite individual existence anymore. The show implies he had a conscience at some point. It doesn't dwell on it. What Finn doesn't get is a real answer to the question of why he was abandoned as a baby. The show gestures at various possibilities, suggests Martin wasn't equipped for parenthood, that the Citadel imprisonment predated or caused the abandonment, that there was something complicated in Martin's past, but it never delivers the clear explanation. Finn has to process the loss of the father he hoped for, and the reality of the father he found without the narrative closure of a complete account. That's realistic, actually, in a way that's harder to pull off than a tidy revelation. Finn's mother presumably exists. She's never mentioned. We don't know her name, her nature, whether she was human or something else, whether she's still alive anywhere in the world, or the multiverse. She's a complete absence. The human community that does exist is discovered during the Islands miniseries, one of the later Adventure Time miniseries that functions almost as a self-contained film. Following clues about humans, Finn and Jake travel to a group of islands in the ocean where a surviving human community has been living for the past 1,000 years. They were kept there by an AI system, the Founder's AI, designed to protect them from the dangerous outside world. The protection system became a kind of benevolent imprisonment over time. People couldn't leave. The AI ensured they didn't want to. Susan Strong, who appeared in the main series as a character Finn initially thought was a mutant fish person, turns out to be a human with extensive cybernetic modifications. She's from the islands. She was out in the world for reasons the show eventually partly explains. Her full backstory, and specifically her relationship to the human community's history, is something the show threads across multiple seasons without ever completing. Dr. Gross is a scientist from the islands who specialized in augmenting humans with animal and mechanical components. She created the concept of the Hyuman warrior class, people modified for combat and survival. Susan was one of her subjects. Dr. Gross shows up in the islands miniseries as an antagonist, then disappears. What happened to her after the island's storyline is unaddressed. She's just gone from the narrative. The islands themselves open up at the end of the main series in the final epilogue. In a brief time-lapse, humans are shown returning to Ooo for the first time in roughly 1,000 years. They walk out into the world. The show doesn't explain how this happened or what changed, because the epilogue isn't a resolution. It's a glimpse of a future that the show is leaving to the audience's imagination. It's hopeful. It doesn't answer anything specific. Finn's arm is a related mystery that gets its own thread. He loses his right arm in a Season 6 storyline involving a confrontation at the Citadel and his father's escape. A flower grows from the wound, which is strange. Eventually, through events involving a grass sword and a version of Finn created from that sword, he grows his arm back. The mythology around the grass sword and its consciousness, and the Finn it eventually became, the character Fern, is one of the show's more elaborate late-season storylines. Fern dies in the finale, planting a seed that grows into a new tree with a grass sword inside. It's cyclical. What the grass sword actually was, cosmically, is implied to be connected to Finn's catalyst comet nature, but that connection is never clearly drawn. Finn ends the show as a young adult who has grown up and grown out of several relationships and several self-images. He's good. He's genuinely heroic in the way the show has always said heroism actually works. Not through strength or destiny, but through consistently choosing to try. His identity as Finn the human remains the same throughout, but by the end it means something different than it did at the start. Not a rarity marker, but a specific person who happens to be human in a world that mostly isn't. Where he ends up, what his life looks like beyond the final episode, and the Distant Land specials, is left entirely open, which is probably the right call. Finn is an adventurer. His story ending would be a contradiction in terms. But talking a bit about what underlies all of this, the world Finn adventures through is built on forces that are much older and stranger than the Mushroom War. Let's talk about where magic comes from in Ooo, and why that question is harder to answer than it should be. Magic in Adventure Time is everywhere, and it's inconsistent, and it works differently depending on who's using it and when and what the show needs it to do at that particular moment. This is both a feature and occasionally a source of genuine lore confusion. But if you sit with the show long enough, a rough shape emerges for how magic functions in Ooo and where it's supposed to have come from. It's just not a particularly tidy shape. The clearest thing the show establishes is that magic left the world at some point before the Mushroom War and then came back when the war destroyed things badly enough. Pendleton Ward's description of Ooo as the product of a catastrophe combined with a magical resurgence is the most authoritative statement on the subject. The bombs cracked something open. Magic returned through that crack alongside the mutations and the strange new species and all the other impossible things that now populate the land. What the show doesn't fully explain is what magic actually is at a fundamental level in this world. Is it a force like gravity, something intrinsic to the structure of the universe that was suppressed and then released? Is it an external influence, something that came from outside the normal order? Is it related to the catalyst comets, which bring transformative energies that seem magical in nature? All of these are possibilities the show implies without committing to. The closest thing to a structural answer comes from the elemental framework. Ooo has 4 primal elemental forces: candy, fire, ice, and slime. These predate humanity. They predate the Mushroom War. In the Cretaceous era, there were already elemental representatives, dinosaur wizards who embodied these forces and built magical institutions around them. Urgent's Evergreen, the ice elemental who made the ice crown, was one of these. His colleagues were Chatsbury the candy elemental, Balthus the fire elemental, and Slimy D the slime elemental. Slimy D is a real name that the show assigned to an ancient primal force of the universe, and I genuinely love that about Adventure Time. They had a civilization, they had politics, they had disagreements about whether to stop the approaching Catalyst comet at all. What happened to that civilization is partly answered. The comet hit anyway. The dinosaurs died, more or less, in the manner we know from the fossil record. But the elemental forces persisted. They reincarnate. Each era has new incarnations of the four elementals, living people who embody those forces, sometimes without knowing they do. Princess Bubblegum is the candy elemental. The fire elemental of the current era is a character named Cinnamon Bun initially, then shifts in complicated ways. Ice King, in his corrupted form, is connected to the ice elemental tradition, even though he's not technically an incarnation of it, so much as a host for the crown. The Slime Princess is the slime elemental. These four forces seem to be the scaffolding on which most of Oo's magic hangs. The kingdoms, the peoples, the environments of Oo broadly correspond to one of the four elements: the Candy Kingdom, the Fire Kingdom, the Ice Kingdom, the Slime Kingdom. When Patience St. Pim, a pre-war ice elemental who froze herself to survive the Mushroom War and awoke 1,000 years later, decides to unlock the full power of all four elementals at once in the late series, she turns all of Oo into a version of one element or another. The world reverts to these four states as if that's the default underlying structure. Outside of the elemental framework, magic in Oo operates through practitioners and objects and locations that have accumulated or generated magical properties over time. The Wizards of Oo have a community, a school, a set of credentials and titles and competitions. The Wizard City Special expands on this. Magic is learnable, teachable, certifiable. It's a skill some people have more aptitude for than others. It's also clearly connected to forces and beings that predate any individual practitioner's understanding of it. There are magical artifacts scattered throughout the show that predate the war, predate Oo, in some cases predate humanity. The Ice Crown is the most prominent of these. The Enchiridion is another, though its full age is uncertain. The Nitosphere's amulet, which governs rule over Hunson Abadier's realm, has been around for an unspecified but very long time. The Night Sword that Finn uses in later seasons has ancient properties. The show builds up an inventory of objects that carry magic accumulated over deep time, far longer than the Mushroom War's 1,000-year radius. One ongoing tension in the show that magic highlights is the conflict between magic and science as frameworks. Princess Bubblegum is consistently positioned as a scientist, someone who approaches the world empirically and has a philosophical resistance to the concept of things being simply magical. She dismisses Jake's stretchy powers as probably a mutation, which turns out to be correct. She invents solutions to problems through technology and biology rather than spell work. Yet she herself is the Candy Elemental, a living embodiment of a magical force, and the kingdom she built is powered by her brother's supernatural juice output. She exists in the middle of things that contradict her worldview, and she manages this by compartmentalizing extremely well. Magic in the show also does something interesting with morality that's worth noticing. It isn't inherently good or evil. The same force that lets Marceline fly and Bubblegum create life also powers the Lich and sustains Hunson Abadier's soul-eating operation. The elementals can be used selflessly or catastrophically. Wizards can serve benevolent or destructive ends. There's a long tradition in fantasy of magic being morally neutral, and Adventure Time holds to that, but it goes a step further by having the same fundamental forces underlie wildly different expressions of magic across the show's cast. Wizard City specifically adds detail about the community dimension of magic. There's a school called Potion Town, where young students learn the craft. There's a hierarchy of titles: brown, green, red, yellow, purple, pink, and finally, Grand Master. Peppermint Butler, who we know has spent centuries practicing dark arts on the side of his day job as Bubblegum's majordomo, navigates this system with the particular advantage of knowing vastly more than he's supposed to at his apparent skill level. The history behind how a piece of peppermint candy became one of the most knowledgeable occultists in Ooo is exactly the kind of question the show raises and never quite answers. The Magic Man is another example of magic's moral complexity. He's a Martian wizard, and his powers are genuinely enormous. He can rewrite reality in ways that most other magical practitioners in the show couldn't dream of. He spent centuries being gratuitously cruel to people in Ooo for seemingly random reasons. The backstory eventually reveals that he lost someone he loved, a Martian woman named Margles, to a catastrophic encounter with an entity called Golb, and that grief curdled into nihilism that expressed itself as chaotic cruelty toward others. When he eventually moves past it, he becomes normal man, gives up his magic, and retires to Mars. His redemption arc is one of the more understated ones in the show. There's also a version of magic in Adventure Time that operates at the level of love and attachment rather than spellwork or elemental force, and this is the version the show returns to most often in its emotional beats. The Ice Crown, which we talked about at length earlier, has a sentimental layer. Simon held on to it partly because the visions it gave him, twisted as they were by the curse, gave him something to hold on to during an otherwise empty stretch of existence. The Enchiridion was built around the concept of heroism, which is a kind of moral magic. BMO was built to understand fun, which the show treats as a kind of magic in its own right. The show never puts all of this together in a single definitive statement about what magic is. And I think that's right. A world that's been running on magic for 1,000 years probably doesn't have a consensus view of it. It's the background radiation of Ooo, present in everything, understood differently by the candy scientist, and the vampire queen, and the ancient wizard, and the shape-shifting alien dog. The fact that it returned after the worst thing humanity ever did to itself is either the universe's compensation or its joke, depending on how you look at it. And the thing that exists at the very edge of all of this, the oldest thing in the whole cosmology, and arguably the least well understood, is what we're going to talk about now. Before the universe existed, according to the Lich's own account, at some point in the series, there was nothing. And before there was nothing, there were monsters. Golb is one of those monsters. It predates everything. It is, in the show's cosmology, older than the concept of existence itself, which is either a genuinely interesting piece of myth-making or an invitation to not think too hard about it. Both are valid responses. Golb's physical form, when it manifests in the finale, is enormous. Roughly a giant sphere of a creature, covered in eyes, exuding a kind of ambient wrongness that affects everything around it. Things that enter its body get dissolved and reconstituted in distorted forms, entropy-driven versions of themselves stripped of their original coherence. It doesn't attack in a conventional sense, it just exists, and its existence is corrosive to the existence of other things. The show describes Golb as the embodiment of chaos and destruction, not in the Lich's specific, extinction-focused sense, but in a broader, more elemental sense. Where Prismo represents a kind of ordered cosmic function, wishes and consequences, and the logical architecture of time and possibility, Golb represents the opposite of architecture. It's the principle that things fall apart, entropy made incarnate and massive. What Golb wants is a harder question. It doesn't seem to want anything in a goal-directed sense. It doesn't have the Lich's philosophical commitment to extinction as a righteous project. It just is, and its being is incompatible with the continued orderly existence of other things. It might be that Golb is beyond wanting. The things that were there before the universe presumably operated on different terms than the things that came after. Betty Groff's connection to Golb is one of the finale's more affecting threads. Betty, who spent years after being pulled through time trying to find a way to save Simon from the Crown's curse, ends up fusing with Golb through a wish she makes to protect him. She wished for Simon's protection. The wish was granted, but the mechanism by which it was granted involved her merging with the entity rather than defeating it, becoming part of it in order to steer it away from the people she loved. What this means for Betty is genuinely unresolved. She doesn't die in the conventional sense. She becomes something else. The Betty-Golb fusion is then apparently dispersed or driven off somehow, but the show doesn't show this with complete clarity. Simon is left alone again, freed from the Crown and restored to himself, but without Betty. She saved him, and in doing so became something he can't reach anymore. Whether any version of her survives within Golb, whether she's conscious in there, or whether the merging erased her selfhood entirely, the show doesn't say. The Nitosphere connection is worth thinking about. Hunson Abadir's realm is defined by chaotic evil. The Nightosphere sustains itself on exactly the kind of entropy and dissolution that Golb represents. The show never explicitly links them, but the resonance is there. Marceline's father, when he's at his most threatening, is essentially channeling the same force Golb embodies. The difference, perhaps, is scale and intent. Hunson pursues chaotic evil as a personal project with specific targets. Golb is chaotic evil as a fundamental property of the universe. There's a passage in the show where Finn observes Golb from a distance and describes it as something like staring into the absence of everything. That's the show doing the thing it does well, taking a cosmological concept and finding the exact human emotional response to it. Golb isn't scary in the way that the Lich is scary. The Lich is frightening because he wants something and pursues it with intelligence and patience. Golb is frightening in the way that the heat death of the universe is frightening, which is to say not immediately threatening, but conceptually enormous, the kind of thing you can contemplate for about 30 seconds before your brain diplomatically changes the subject. The Crown's cure via Golb is another unresolved thread. Being swallowed by Golb and then expelled from it somehow breaks the Ice Crown's hold on Simon. This is not explained mechanically. The show presents it as something that happened inside Golb's digestive process. The Crown's curse was a kind of ordered magical corruption, and Golb's internal environment is so corrosive to all forms of ordered existence that even the curse couldn't maintain itself in there. Simon came out the other side without it. The Crown came out separately, landing at Gunther's feet and beginning its next cycle, that the solution to a 1,000-year magical curse was to be eaten by an ancient chaos entity and then expelled. It's genuinely Adventure Time, at its most Adventure Time. It's not elegant, it makes a strange kind of internal sense. Nobody planned it, it just happened because of a convergence of circumstances in the middle of a very large battle, and the result was the thing that everyone who loved Simon had been trying to achieve for the entire run of the show. There are aspects of Golb that connect to questions about the show's multiverse architecture. If Golb is the principle of entropy made manifest, what is its relationship to all the parallel universes that exist alongside the main Ooo timeline? Does it extend across all of them? Is there one Golb or many? The show doesn't go there. Golb is, for the purposes of the main series, a local crisis rather than a universal constant, even if its mythology suggests it should be a universal constant. This is probably the right call for narrative purposes. You can't fight a universal constant, you need it to be something specific that shows up at a specific time for the story to work. There's a fan theory, a fairly persistent one, that Golb and the Nightosphere are more directly connected than the show states, that they're two faces of the same fundamental force. Hunson Abadir existing since before time, sustaining himself on chaos, ruling a hell dimension, and Golb existing since before the universe as the principle of chaos, are either a coincidence of the show's mythology or an unexplored connection that the writers had in mind and didn't have time to develop. Either way, the parallel is there. The show plants things like this semi-consciously throughout its run. Not every seed was meant to be grown. Some were just part of the texture. Golb leaves the finale not destroyed exactly, more dispersed or temporarily contained. It was there before the universe. It'll be around after whatever the show depicts. The Adventure Time world continues to exist in its shadow. Most of the people in Ooo are probably not aware of it. Simon is now, and he has to carry the knowledge that his freedom cost Betty something irreversible. That's the Lich section's observation about cosmic forces applied to a much more personal level. The largest thing doesn't have to reach all the way down to affect the smallest things. Sometimes the connection is just one person who loved someone and made a wish. And so, now, let's talk about everything after. The epilogue the show gave us, and all the threads that are still technically in the air. The Adventure Time finale aired in September 2018, and it did what finales of long-running shows with dense mythologies usually have to do. It tried to give enough closure to feel satisfying, while leaving enough open to feel honest about what a show like this can actually conclude. Come Along With Me, the 4-part finale, resolves the Gumball threat and the Golb encounter, and gives Marceline and Princess Bubblegum their overdue moment, and shows us the world in the immediate aftermath. Then it shows us the very far future, glimpsed through the framing device of future scholars studying old footage of Oo's history. The far future glimpse is striking. A character named Beth, who appears to be a descendant of Jake's bloodline, and a human-like character named Shermie, are shown having adventures in a version of Ooo that's thousands of years further on from where the main series takes place. The landscape has changed again. New kingdoms, new configurations. They find the old treehouse. They climb the mountains that used to be Jake in one of the show's stranger images. They're having a fine time. The world kept going. And then the show continued anyway. The Distant Lands specials on HBO Max gave us 4 episodes released across 2020 and 2021, each focused on a different set of characters. The BMO special is probably the most standalone of the 4, set in space, following BMO on an accidental adventure involving alien children and a planet under threat. It's lovely, and it confirms that the MO company legacy has somehow extended into space, that there are MOs out there beyond Earth's orbit, which creates as many questions as it answers. Why are there MOs in space? Did Mo have a space program at some point? The episode doesn't explain. It just shows you that the robots got there somehow and are doing things. The Obsidian special is the one that deals most directly with unresolved history, and it focuses on Marceline and Bubblegum's relationship in the present and its origins in the past. The Glass Kingdom provides the setting, a society of crystalline beings built around a furnace, threatened by a monster called Molto that's sealed beneath their city and starting to wake up. Marceline and Bubblegum go to address the threat, and their different approaches to the problem reveal the shape of their old conflict more clearly than the main series ever did. What Obsidian establishes in a series of flashbacks is that Marceline and Bubblegum were close for a long time, centuries probably, in the early years of Oo's development. Bubblegum created the Glass Kingdom. The falling out between them happened there, over exactly the situation that Molto represents. Marceline wanted to kill the threat, and Bubblegum wanted to contain it, and Bubblegum's containment approach won in a way that was cold and clinical and felt to Marceline like being overruled and dismissed. So Marceline left, and they didn't really talk again for a very long time. The shirt, the one that Bubblegum had kept for potentially centuries, the shirt Marceline gave her that first night at a concert, is central to the emotional resolution. Bubblegum had held onto it all that time. Marceline hadn't known. The object did what objects in Adventure Time often do. It carried information about a relationship that the people in the relationship couldn't say directly to each other. What Obsidian doesn't do is fill in all the centuries in between. We know roughly when their friendship began. We know roughly when it ended. We know what they've been doing in the immediate present of the show. The middle portion, the hundreds of years of Marceline's existence, during which she and Bubblegum weren't speaking and weren't anywhere near each other, remains as open as it was before the special. Together again, the third Distant Lands special is the one that deals with Jake's death. It takes place in the New Death dimension, a realm for the dead that's been disrupted because its previous ruler has been deposed and replaced by a problematic entity. Finn dies, deliberately or accidentally, depending on how you read a specific moment, to reach Jake in the afterlife. The two of them work together to restore order to the dead realm. It's a reunion built on the premise that even death doesn't separate them for very long, which is genuinely warm. The circumstances of Jake's actual death are left vague. The special doesn't show it. We know it happened sometime after the main series ended, presumably from old age, in the way that magical dogs eventually age, even if they do it more slowly than regular dogs. He died off-screen, in the gap between stories, which feels right for Jake. He wasn't someone who would have made a big deal of it. The fourth Distant Lands special, Wizard City, follows Peppermint Butler at a magic school after losing most of his memory. This one is interesting partly because it expands the understanding of how magical education works in Ooo, and partly because it gives Peppermint Butler the most extended standalone focus he's ever had. He's clearly a much bigger deal than his role as Bubblegum's attendant suggested for most of the series. The centuries of dark arts practice have made him genuinely formidable. The school recognizes this even when he doesn't have access to his own memories. He's the kind of person who is impressive even when he doesn't know he's impressive. His backstory, though, remains largely unexplained. The oldest question about Peppermint Butler is simply, what is he? He was there at the founding of the Candy Kingdom, or close to it. He practices magic that most candy people would find incomprehensible. He has relationships with death entities and demon lords that suggest a history extending far back into Oo's early centuries. The Wizard City special gives him a present tense arc without really touching the deep history. Fine for the purposes of the story. Slightly unsatisfying if you wanted answers. Fiona and Cake, the 2023 series, is worth spending some time on because it's the most ambitious extension of the Adventure Time universe and the one that opens the most new threads while attempting to close some old ones. The premise? Fiona and Cake are characters from Ice King's fanfiction who turn out to exist as real people in a parallel universe where all the Adventure Time characters are gender-swapped. This universe is running on borrowed time because a cosmic entity called the Scarab is trying to destroy it, along with all other alternate universes, on the grounds that they shouldn't exist. Simon Petrikov is the series' emotional anchor. Now freed from the Ice Crown, he's trying to live an ordinary life in a city remarkably similar to a real modern city. He feels out of place and out of time, which is accurate. He is literally a pre-war human who spent 1,000 years as a corrupted magical entity and has now been dropped back into something resembling normal life. He joins Fiona and Cake on their multiverse adventure, partly because he has nothing better to do, and partly because the show needs him to confront what his 1,000 years of existence actually means when he's no longer defined by the crown. The Scarab is a new villain and an interesting one. He's a bureaucrat of cosmic order, essentially, assigned to maintain the integrity of the universe's timeline by ensuring that anomalous realities don't persist. The alternate universes represent anomalies to him. His job is to eliminate them. He's not evil in a conventional sense. He's doing exactly what he was assigned to do. The problem is that living people inhabit these anomalies, and eliminating the universes means eliminating them. There's an interesting question the show raises through the Scarab about whether anomalous things have the right to continue existing just because they exist and are loved. Fiona's universe was created indirectly by the Ice King's wish fulfillment, and shouldn't, by the logic of the cosmic order, be real. But it is real. Fiona and Cake are real. The people they know are real. At what point does an accident of creation become legitimate? The show takes a clear position on this, unsurprisingly given the kind of show it is, but the philosophical question is genuinely interesting. The Candy Queen, which appears in Fiona and Cake as a corrupted alternate universe version of Princess Bubblegum, is one of the more effective late series villains. She's what Bubblegum becomes when the authoritarian tendencies aren't kept in check by the genuine care, a ruler who has decided that control is the entire point. The horror of her is partly that she's recognizably Bubblegum, and partly that she represents a version of Bubblegum that isn't entirely far-fetched. Bubblegum has come close to this in her worst moments in the main series. The Candy Queen is a version where she didn't pull back. Prismo's limitations, which Fiona and Cake addresses, are another interesting addition. He can grant wishes, but he can't grant wishes for himself, essentially. He can't solve his own problems with wishes in the way that visitors to the Time Room can. The show uses this to create a situation where Prismo, for all his cosmic power, is as dependent on other people's help as anyone else. There's something egalitarian about that fits the show's general sensibility. Now, the specific mysteries from the main series that remain genuinely open after all of this extended universe content. Martin Mertens is one. Finn's biological father, last seen absorbed into an alien collective somewhere in space, is technically unaccounted for. The alien collective absorbed him. He may have a form of continued existence somewhere in the universe. Whether he ever reconnected with anything that was recognizably himself, whether he thought about Finn in whatever cognitive state he ended up in, is something the show simply doesn't address. His arc closed with abandonment and a kind of dispersal that was neither death nor resolution. Susan Strong's full story is another. The Islands miniseries expands her backstory considerably, establishing her as a human from the island community who was modified by Dr. Gross and sent out into the world. But the specifics of her relationship with the island's governing AI, the full history of what happened to her between being created as a modified human and arriving in Ooo, and what she does in the present of the show after the island's storyline are left open. She appears in the finale. She's there for the Golb fight, and then the show moves on without giving her a concluding arc. Dr. Gross just vanishes. She's present in the Islands miniseries as a significant antagonist, then last seen somewhere in the Islands system, and then she's never mentioned again. She's a scientist who spent centuries modifying human beings, and who clearly has a very specific vision of what humans should be. What she does when the humans leave the islands and head back to Ooo is a question the show chose not to answer. Maybe the creators had plans for her. Maybe she was always meant to be a one-arc character who served her narrative purpose and stepped off. The Night Owl is a minor mystery, but a persistent one in fan discussions. There's a recurring image in the show, easy to miss, of an owl appearing in various background shots and transitional moments, sometimes at night, sometimes in places that feel slightly significant. Whether this is a recurring background gag or something more intentional is debated. The show never flags it as meaningful. It might be one of those things that exists because the artists liked the image and kept using it. Or it might be the kind of thing the show would have addressed eventually if it had more time. Lemongrab is an entire category of unresolved questions on his own. Bubblegum created him as an experiment in creating life, and the experiment produced something deeply wrong in ways she didn't predict and couldn't fully manage. Lemongrab is in constant psychological distress. His existence is painful to him and eventually destructive to everything around him. The show treats him with genuine compassion even as he behaves horribly, which is a difficult balance it maintains with impressive consistency. He dies in the show in a way that is both horrible and somehow comprehensible given the arc of his story, and the question of what Bubblegum's responsibility for creating him actually looked like morally is raised but never answered with finality. The comet cycle is also technically unresolved. It arrives periodically. It brings transformation. The show's main series covers one arrival. The implication of the mythology is that it will come again. Whatever it brings next time, whatever force or being or change arrives via the comet in the future of Ooo is beyond the scope of anything the show has depicted. Beth and Shermie, the far future adventurers from the finale's framing device, are living in a world where at least one more comet cycle has presumably occurred. What that means for their version of Ooo is unknown. The snail that appears in every episode is a running gag that also turns out to be plot relevant. The Lich possesses the snail at some point and uses it as a vehicle to move around undetected. Once the Lich is dealt with, the snail is presumably fine, but the snail continues appearing in episodes as a background detail. Was it always the snail, even before the possession? Is the snail's ongoing appearances a remnant of the Lich's brief occupation? Probably not. It's almost certainly just a visual gag the animators maintained throughout the series. But Adventure Time is the kind of show where you can never be entirely sure. What the full body of the show leaves behind, in the main series and all its extensions, is less a list of unsolved problems and more a sense of a world that has more history and present and future than any telling of its story could exhaust. That's actually what the best world building does. Not create a complete and internally consistent system, but create a place that feels like it would keep going whether or not you're watching it. Ooo keeps going. The Candy People go to work in the morning, Marceline plays music in her cave, Simon makes coffee in his flat in the city and thinks about the last 1,000 years and tries to figure out what to do with a Wednesday. Jake is wherever Jake went after. Finn is out there somewhere, adventuring. The mysteries that stay open aren't failures of the show. They're evidence that Ooo is alive in the way that real things are alive, with more going on than you can ever fully account for. One of the things Adventure Time does quietly and persistently throughout its run is build a functional political landscape for the Land of Ooo, and then mostly ignore it in favor of individual adventures. But the political structure is there if you look for it, and it raises its own set of questions that the show gestures toward without always pursuing. Ooo is a collection of kingdoms. There's the Candy Kingdom, the Ice Kingdom, the Fire Kingdom, the Slime Kingdom, the Cloud Kingdom, the Breakfast Kingdom, the Lumpy Space Kingdom, and dozens of smaller principalities and territories and single-ruler domains scattered across the landscape. The majority of these are ruled by princess-level figures, which is one of the show's more deliberately odd structural choices. Almost every domain has a princess. There are very few kings or queens. The political hierarchy of Ooo is heavily princess-weighted, and the show acknowledges this without fully explaining it. The Princess Bubblegum context helps somewhat. She's been around since near the beginning of Oo's current civilization, and she's called herself a princess since the moment she took the title, partly as a reclamation of a sarcastic nickname, and partly because she wasn't about to call herself a queen when she'd only just started. The title stuck, and given her outsized influence on the development of early Ooo, it's possible that her example shaped how other emerging leaders identified themselves. Or the show just liked the aesthetic of a world full of princesses and made the choice for creative reasons, which is equally plausible. The Fire Kingdom is ruled by the Flame King, and his daughter, Flame Princess, is one of the more interesting political figures in the show's secondary cast. Flame Princess's backstory establishes that she was considered too dangerous to leave free, that her own father imprisoned her, because the Fire Kingdom's advisors believed her power was uncontrolled and destructive. Finn falls for her in the middle seasons of the show, and their relationship is partly about the question of whether someone can be genuinely good when they've been told their whole life that they're dangerous by nature. The answer the show gives is nuanced. Flame Princess is powerful and sometimes destructive, but she's not inherently evil. She was made to believe she was by her father, who found her inconvenient and scary. She eventually overthrows her father and takes the Fire Kingdom's throne herself, which is one of the show's more satisfying political resolutions. The Fire Kingdom under Flame Princess is, by the show's end, a significantly better functioning state than it was under her father. Lady Rainicorn, Jake's partner, is from a Rainicorn community that's never deeply explored in the main series. Lady speaks Korean throughout the show, with English subtitles rarely provided, which creates an interesting linguistic texture. Jake understands her. Most English-speaking viewers don't, unless they happen to speak Korean or find the subtitles. The show treats her as a full character, while keeping most of what she says just outside the easy comprehension of the audience. It's a choice that keeps her somewhat mysterious in a pleasant way. The Rainicorn community and its history, its relationship to the broader Ooo landscape, its origins, are never the focus of an episode. Lady is important to Jake, and by extension important to the show, but her background is communicated more through implication than exposition. She and Jake have 5 children together. Those children have varying combinations of their parents' traits. Their eldest, Kim Kil-wan, is a fully functional adult who runs a business by the time the later seasons arrive. The kids are living their own lives off-screen in ways the show only occasionally checks in on. The Lumpy Space Princess, meanwhile, is royalty of a cloud kingdom called Lumpy Space that exists above Ooo and is populated by lumpy floating entities who speak in a particular register that is basically a caricature of Valley Girl affectation. She's a recurring figure in the early seasons who becomes more of a background presence later, occasionally showing up to complain about her parents or her social life. Her kingdom and its history are never detailed. She represents a category of Adventure Time supporting character who feels like they have a whole story behind them that the show never gets around to telling. The political relationships between kingdoms create a kind of background geopolitics that erupts into the foreground occasionally. The Candy Kingdom and the Fire Kingdom have a history of tension. The Ice Kingdom under Ice King was in a state of persistent low-level conflict with everyone, mostly because Ice King kept kidnapping princesses. The Slime Kingdom is peaceful but strange. The Cloud Kingdom barely registers as a presence, despite being the home territory of one of the show's most frequently appearing secondary characters. One of the show's most pointed political storylines involves Princess Bubblegum being deposed by an election that she loses to the King of Ooo, a character who is essentially a fraud and a con artist who wins through populism and manipulation. The Candy People, who Bubblegum created and has been governing for centuries, vote against her. The show is somewhat explicit about why. She made them too simple-minded, too easily led, and then was surprised when they were too easily led away from her. It's a critique embedded in fantasy politics that's fairly sharp about the self-defeating nature of paternalistic governance. She gets the throne back eventually, after the King of Oo's inadequacy becomes impossible to ignore. But the show doesn't entirely absolve her. She's a better ruler for the experience, or at least a more self-aware one. The Candy People remain what they are. The broader question of what governance looks like in a world that emerged from civilizational collapse is something the show treats mostly through individual kingdoms and their particular flavors of dysfunction. There's no Ooo-wide government. There are alliances and conflicts and treaties and occasional coalitions against shared threats, but the political structure is fundamentally medieval in its fragmentation, each kingdom a largely self-governing entity with its own rules. That fragmentation makes sense given the origin. Ooo wasn't built from a surviving government. It was built by 1,000 small civilizations growing independently in the wreckage of the old world. You'd expect exactly this kind of patchwork political geography. The Lich, periodically, represents the only force that genuinely unites the kingdoms against a common enemy, which is, again, something the show doesn't over-articulate, but that's visible in the structure. The things that bring the kingdoms together are the things that threaten everyone simultaneously. Short of that, each kingdom manages its own problems in its own way, which is true enough about how politics actually works that it doesn't require a fantasy gloss to recognize. What the show's political world mostly leaves open is the question of where it's heading. The epilogue shows humans returning to Ooo. The far future glimpse shows Beth and Shermie in a Ooo that's reconfigured again. The intermediate period, the centuries or millennia between those 2 points, is a complete blank. Every kingdom we've come to know might look entirely different by the time Shermie is poking around in old ruins, which is also true enough about real history to feel appropriate. Adventure Time accumulated a lot of supporting characters over its 10 seasons, and a meaningful number of them have threads that were opened with apparent intent and then left unresolved when the show ran out of time or changed direction. This is worth spending some time with because these characters represent a different category of mystery from the cosmological ones. The cosmological questions are unanswered because the show chose to leave them that way. The character questions are often unanswered because the show simply didn't get back to them. Jermaine is Jake's full biological brother, born in the normal manner to Joshua and Margaret, in the moments before Jake arrived via pustule. He spent his early adulthood maintaining the family home and guarding the various deals Joshua had made with demons and spirits over the course of his detective career. Joshua was apparently very casual about entering into demon agreements and left his surviving son with an enormous backlog of debt obligations to supernatural entities. Jermaine spent years managing these obligations more or less alone. When Finn and Jake do eventually reconnect with him, the relationship is complicated by years of accumulated grievance. Jermaine felt overlooked by his father, who seemed more interested in the extraordinary children than in the ordinary one. He eventually burns down the family home, releasing all the demons at once, rather than continuing to manage them indefinitely. This is presented as a kind of liberation. He starts painting, he seems okay. Then he appears briefly in later seasons to help Jake figure out his true shape-shifting form. After that, the show moves on from him. What Jermaine's life looks like in the long run, whether he found what he was looking for after releasing himself from the demon obligations, whether he and Jake maintained their reconciled relationship, is never shown. He's one of those characters who exists in the show's peripheral vision, present but not central, and the show's momentum doesn't slow down long enough to give him a proper conclusion. Tree Trunks and Mr. Pig are an older elephant and pig who live together and are deeply in love, and who end up adopting Sweet Pea, the baby that the Lich regresses into. This makes them, technically, the parental guardians of an ancient cosmic force of extinction. The show plays this mostly for warmth and occasional comedy. Tree Trunks bakes apple pies, Mr. Pig is supportive, Sweet Pea grows up in their home and calls them Mom and Dad. Whether they fully understand what Sweet Pea is, whether they have any sense of the thing that exists dormant inside him, is something the show never clarifies. They love him. That seems to be enough for the show, and possibly enough for the situation. Ash was Marceline's ex-boyfriend, a wizard who sold her beloved stuffed bear Hambo to a witch without permission, which is how the bear ends up in the story at all. He's presented as a possessive and manipulative ex who tries to use magic to rekindle the relationship. He doesn't succeed. He's defeated, and that's the last we see of him. His backstory with Marceline, the full arc of their relationship before and after the period shown in the episode, is never depicted. He represents a chapter of Marceline's very long life that we get the conclusion of without the context. Flame Princess's brother is a minor figure who appears in a few episodes and represents the internal politics of the Fire Kingdom. He's resentful, as many royal siblings are in these narratives. He doesn't get much development, he exists to complicate the Fire Kingdom's situation and then recedes. Same category as Jermaine, really, a character who implies a story behind them that the show doesn't tell. The Magic Man's relationship to his late partner Margles is one of those backstories that the show delivers in fragments across multiple seasons before assembling into a coherent picture in the later Magic Man-focused episodes. Margles was Martian, she was lost to Golb in some kind of encounter that also damaged the Magic Man's capacity for normal behavior. The specifics of what happened to her, whether she was absorbed by Golb as Betty later was, whether something of her persists, are never fully addressed. She's the reason the Magic Man is the way he is. but she herself remains almost entirely off-screen. Peppermint Butler's pre-show history is probably the deepest blank in the show's character roster. He's been with Bubblegum for somewhere between hundreds and 800 years. He practices dark arts involving demons and death entities with a fluency that suggests either extremely long practice or an origin that predates his employment with the Candy Kingdom. He knows Hunson Abadir well enough to interact with him professionally. He has a history with the death entity, significant enough that death appears at his school graduation ceremony as a supporting presence. None of this is ever traced back to its beginning. The Wizard City special advances his story without providing his origin. He's an expert without a clear account of how he became expert. The show is satisfied with this. I'm not sure it should be, but the alternative would probably be an entire prequel series about a peppermint candy practicing black magic for 8 centuries, which I would absolutely watch and which will almost certainly never exist. Choose Goose is a character who sells adventuring equipment in rhyming couplets and whose benevolence or malevolence is genuinely ambiguous in early seasons before the show settles into treating him as mostly harmless. His nature, what he is, why he speaks exclusively in rhyme, whether he's always been in Ooo or arrived from somewhere else, is never explained. His background texture with a personality. The snail, already mentioned briefly, deserves its own acknowledgement as a character mystery. Every single episode of Adventure Time contains the same snail hidden somewhere in the background. This was a production gag initially, similar to the hidden Mickey Mouse ears in Disney parks. But when the Lich began using the snail as a vessel, the gag became plot relevant. After that storyline resolved, the snail kept appearing anyway. So either the snail survived its possession with no lasting effects and continued its placid existence in Oo's background, or there's something significant about why the snail appears literally everywhere throughout the show's timeline, including in episodes that take place before the possession. Fan theories abound. The show offers nothing. Cuba is the framing device narrator for the Grable's episodes, a far-future alien who tells stories about people from old Ooo the way a scholar might tell stories about ancient history. His timeline is thousands of years after the main series, his culture is completely alien to the Ooo we know, and his relationship to the events he narrates is purely historical. He knows that Finn and Jake and Bubblegum were real people from a very long time ago, the way we know about historical figures. The gap between Cuba's Ooo and the show's Ooo is never bridged. The Grable's episodes exist as islands of far future whose connection to the present of the show is implied but not drawn. And then there's Billy's girlfriend, Canyon, who appears in a late episode and who clearly had a significant relationship with Billy before his death. She's processing grief and regret in ways the show takes seriously for the duration of her episode. Then she's gone, one of many characters who exist in the show's peripheral world, with full emotional lives that the narrative can only briefly illuminate before moving on. The show's supporting cast is essentially an argument that Ooo is a real place, populated by an enormous number of individuals, each of whom has more going on than the camera can track. The characters the show didn't finish are features of that density rather than failures of execution. Though I'll admit that some of them, Peppermint Butler especially, feel more like deferred obligations than deliberate mysteries. One detail worth closing this section on. In the far future glimpse at the end of Come Along With Me, Beth and Shermie discover what appears to be Jake's fossilized form on a mountain, enormous and stone, overlooking the landscape. There are 2 readings of this. One is that some version of Jake ended up enormous and then died in that position, and time turned him to stone, and that's just a mountain now. The other is that Jake, with his shape-shifting abilities and his alien biology, might still be in there somewhere, having chosen a form he could hold for a very long time. The show doesn't tell you which one. Shermie and Beth climb the mountain and have adventures, and it doesn't come up. I like not knowing, honestly. Some questions are better as mountains. There's a specific relationship Adventure Time has with the idea of heroism that's worth unpacking because it runs through nearly everything in the show, and it's one of the ways the show distinguishes itself from more straightforward adventure narratives. The show is interested in heroism as a practice, not a status, and it uses the mythology around Billy and the Enchiridion to explore what that distinction actually looks like. Billy was the greatest hero of Ooo in the generation before Finn and Jake. He was enormous, he was powerful, he fought monsters and won, he defeated the Lich and imprisoned him, he was universally admired. Songs were written about him. He was the standard against which all heroic efforts in Ooo were measured. Finn, when the show begins, idolizes him in the specific way that young people idolize figures who seem to embody the thing they aspire to be. By the time Finn actually meets Billy, Billy has retired. Not because he ran out of power or courage, but because he ran out of belief. He spent years defeating monsters and went back to check on the people he'd helped and found that the world had simply generated more monsters, more pain, more suffering in the places he'd cleared. The heroic act hadn't changed the underlying condition. He stopped being able to see the point. This is one of the show's most earnest engagements with the question of what it means to keep going in the face of evidence that individual action doesn't fix systemic problems. Billy's response is withdrawal. Finn's response, which develops across the whole series, is something more complicated. Continuing anyway, not because it changes everything, but because each individual moment of help is real and valuable to the specific person you helped in that specific moment. The show is quiet about this as a conclusion. It doesn't announce it, but it's there in the arc. The Enchiridion, a famous book of heroic wisdom, is Finn's ideal object in the early seasons. He goes on a major quest to find it. When he does, it's a real and useful thing, a guide to being a genuine hero, compiled by someone who clearly thought deeply about what heroism requires. It has rules and principles and specific advice. Finn carries it with reverence. What the Enchiridion turns out to also be is a key. Assembled with specific gems from the major monarchs of Ooo, it can open a portal to the time room and from there access the full multiverse. This repurposing of a heroic text as a multi-dimensional key is either a coincidence of magical object design or a commentary on the relationship between heroic ideals and cosmic forces. The show doesn't make the commentary explicit, but there's something suggestive in the idea that a book about how to be good in the world is also the mechanism for accessing the room outside of time where reality's most fundamental rules can be bent. The book is eventually destroyed in the process of accessing the time room. By that point, it has served both its purposes. It helped Finn understand what he was trying to be, and it helped him access what he needed to access when the stakes were at their highest. Objects in Adventure Time often have this double function. They mean something to the people who carry them, and they mean something to the machinery of the plot, and occasionally those two meanings align in ways that feel earned because the show spent time building both. Billy's relationship to the Enchiridion's philosophy is implicit. He embodied it once, he stopped believing in it, then the Lich killed him and wore his face, which is the show's most concentrated image of what happens when heroism is hollowed out. The form remains, but the meaning is gone, and worse, the form is actively used against the thing it used to protect. Finn recognizing that something was wrong with Billy before the full reveal of the possession is one of the show's nicer character moments. He knew his idol well enough to sense the wrongness, even before he could name it. The heroism mythology also extends to the Citadel, the multi-dimensional prison that holds the worst criminals in the universe. The Citadel's guardians are crystalline beings of apparently benevolent magical nature who maintain the prison structure. They're impressive, ancient, clearly part of a system older than Ooo. The system gets compromised by the Lich's actions. The guardians are wounded or destroyed in the process. The prison breaks open. The idea of a cosmic justice system running quietly in the background of the Adventure Time universe is introduced and then dismantled in the span of a few episodes. What replaces it, who runs the prison now, whether the worst criminals are still contained or scattered throughout the multiverse, is left open. Martin Mertens, being in the Citadel, connects to this. He's not a cosmic-level villain. He's a charming, selfish human man who committed crimes serious enough to warrant multidimensional imprisonment. The Citadel apparently accepts all categories of criminal, from the catastrophic to the merely serious. The specifics of what Martin did aren't fully enumerated. The show says he hurt people, and then ran, repeatedly, over a long life spent avoiding consequences. In a universe where being a bad parent gets you thrown in the same facility as the force that wants to end all existence, the moral calculus is strange. But the show doesn't actually intend that comparison as a statement. It's just that the Citadel happened to be a convenient plot convergence point. What the heroism thread concludes with, by the end of the show, and especially in the It Together Again special, is Finn as someone who has simply kept going. Not because he achieved some final victory, not because heroism turned out to be a guaranteed solution to anything, but because continuing is what he does, and because the specific people he's continued alongside have made the continuing worthwhile. The show's answer to Billy's despair isn't a refutation of his diagnosis. It's a different relationship to the same reality. That's not a tidy answer. It's the right one for this show. Adventure Time uses music in a way that a lot of animated series don't. Songs in the show aren't just entertainment breaks or mood-setting devices. Several of them are doing real narrative work, carrying information about characters and their histories that the dialogue doesn't always deliver directly. If you watch the show with this in mind, you start noticing how much the music knows. Marceline's Fry song is probably the most famous example. It appears in the episode It Came from the Nightosphere when Finn asks her to teach him about her dad. She performs the song for him, and it's structured as an indictment. She lists specific grievances against her father, starting with the fries he ate off her plate in the ruins of a post-war diner when she was a teenager. The fries are genuinely the proximate cause, but the song is really about neglect and disappointment and the specific pain of feeling invisible to a parent who is immortal and powerful and ought to have been able to make time for you if he'd tried. Rebecca Sugar, who went on to create Steven Universe, wrote the Fry song among several other Adventure Time tracks. The original draft apparently went further in the explicit emotional content than the version that aired. The aired version lands hard enough. It's a comedy song in formal terms, with an absurd premise, and it's also a genuine expression of grief about a parent who was present in theory and absent in practice. Hunson learning what the song contains, when Finn plays it for him, is the episode's emotional turning point. He'd never heard it before. He didn't know she'd written it. That's a lore detail that's easy to miss. Hunson had never heard the Fry song. Marceline wrote it and performed it and never played it for him. It was a private grief made public only because Finn got involved. The song existed in Marceline's history for some unknown period of time before it appears in the show, carrying its burden for all those centuries, and the moment it reaches its intended audience is handled almost incidentally, tucked inside a comedy episode about a demon eating souls. The stakes, the Simon and Marty duet from the episode I Remember You, is the show at its most direct about using music to carry history. The episode involves Ice King trying to write a song with Marceline and being unable to understand why she's upset with him, because his memory of Simon is so fragmented by the crown that he doesn't remember their connection. Marceline has been carrying this loss for 1,000 years. She knows he doesn't remember. She's furious and heartbroken, and she writes the song in front of him anyway. What I Remember You establishes, partly through the lyrics of the song they eventually find in Simon's old notes, is that Simon was trying to communicate with Marceline through the crown's deterioration. He wrote notes to himself in the crown's state, trying to leave something for her. The notes become song lyrics. Marceline finds them. The song they end up performing is partly Simon's words, written when he still knew her, and partly Marceline's response, written in the present of the show. It's a conversation across 1,000 years, mediated by a piece of paper and two people who are no longer the people who originally needed to have it. This is an unusual thing for a cartoon to do. It requires the audience to understand a relationship that's mostly been shown in fragments, to feel the weight of time that the show has only depicted in glimpses. The fact that it works is a testament to how carefully the earlier episodes had laid the groundwork. All the Stars, which Marceline performs in the Stakes miniseries, is a quieter piece of music that does something different. It's about permanence, about the things that were there before she was and will be thereafter. It's also, obliquely, about the loneliness of outliving everyone who knew you in a specific time. Marceline has done this multiple times over. The people she knew before the war are gone. The people she knew in the centuries after the war are mostly gone. Even the Ice King, who shared her history, has forgotten it. The stars were there for all of it, and will be there after all of it. The music in Adventure Time creates its own kind of continuity alongside the visual and narrative one. Songs don't get forgotten between episodes the way some plot threads do. When a character performs something emotionally significant, it stays attached to them. Marceline in the finale, still playing her axe-based guitar, is connected backward to every song she's performed across the series. The instrument itself is made from a family heirloom battle axe, and it's been mentioned that she made it herself, that the conversion from weapon to instrument was her own project at some point in her very long history. The object carries her whole arc. BMO's songs deserve a mention here. They appear in small moments throughout the show, usually when BMO is alone or thinks no one is watching. They're often about identity and longing and the question of what BMO is, wrapped in a musical delivery that's so guileless and sweet that the underlying depth sneaks up on you. BMO singing to itself in an empty room about what it means to exist is doing the same work as Marceline's big emotional ballads, just at a much smaller and quieter scale. The show understood that not all of its biggest emotional moments needed to be loud. The music in Adventure Time is one of its lasting textures. After the show ended, people were still playing the songs about eating fries, and songs about wanting someone to remember you, and songs about looking at stars. The history of Ooo lives in those songs as much as it lives in any lore document or wiki page, maybe more. So that's where we've been tonight. The war that ended the world and then accidentally made it beautiful again. The archaeologist who found a very old hat at the wrong moment. The 1,000-year-old vampire who kept a stuffed bear for 6 centuries because a stranger gave it to her in the ruins of a city that no longer exists. The candy blob that became a scientist and a ruler and a person. The alien dog who believed a sweet lie about a mud puddle for his whole life. The small robot built for a child who was never born. The embodiment of extinction who became a baby and went to school. None of these mysteries fully resolve. Some of them get closer to answers than others. Most of them are just the edges of something larger that the show was, always going to outgrow before it could chart it completely. I've always thought that what makes Adventure Time's unanswered questions tolerable, even pleasant to sit with, is that the show earned them. It wasn't lazy about its mythology. It added layers and connections and implications, and then built characters on top of all that architecture who felt real enough that you stopped needing the architecture to be complete. Once you care about Simon and Marceline and Jake and BMO, the gaps in the lore stop feeling like omissions and start feeling like space. Room for the world to be bigger than what you're looking at. There's more we could have talked about tonight. The Fire Kingdom's complicated internal history, the Candy People's surprisingly dark origin as a society Bubblegum created to solve her loneliness. The question of what Oo's fauna is made of, genetically, given that 1,000 years of post-nuclear mutation has produced everything from sentient rainicorns to living furniture. The nighttime creatures that Finn and Jake occasionally encounter, who clearly have their own communities and histories, and who the show treats as peripheral. There's the cosmic owl, who appears in prophetic dreams, and whose role in the larger cosmology is implied to be significant but never fully mapped. There's the Lich's well of power, which sits beneath Ooo, like a scar in the earth, and whose nature the show describes but never fully explains. There's the Door Lord from the early episode What Was Missing, who steals objects of emotional significance from people, and whose motivation is never addressed beyond the simple fact of the stealing. There's Lemongrab's lemon children, and the question of what a lemongrab created life actually inherits from its maker. There's the Elemental miniseries and Patient Street, Pym, who froze herself in a glacier to wait out the Mushroom War, and woke up 1,000 years later to find that Ooo had managed without her, and that she was, in certain crucial ways, very out of touch. There are entire episodes that feel like they were originally part of something larger that got compressed or disconnected from its intended context. There are characters who arrive with the weight of backstory and depart without delivering it. There are images in the show's visual language, the recurring snail, the specific colour of the Lich's green, the shape of the crown against certain skies, that feel like they're pointing at something the show knew and didn't say out loud. Maybe another night. Adventure Time ran for 8 years and kept going after it ended, and it's still not done being itself in some fundamental way, because the questions it planted are still sitting there in the minds of people who loved it, quietly growing. That's a rare thing for a show to do. Most things conclude and then they're concluded. This one concludes and then it keeps mattering. For now, if you're still awake, I hope the questions were good company. If you're not, well, that was the point. Ooo will still be there whenever you come back to it. The Candy Kingdom's lights are on, somewhere in the dark. Marceline is playing something in her cave. Jake is mountain-shaped in the distance. BMO is probably wearing a hat and doing something quietly industrious and excellent. And whatever's in Sweet Pea's dreams is, for this moment, still asleep. Sleep well. Ooo will be here.